This is Your Anxiety Toolkit, episode number 172. Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Hello, friends. Welcome back. I am so thrilled to have you here with me. I'm actually really excited to share with you this episode. We have on with us today the amazing Jon Hershfield. Jon Hershfield is the director of the Center for OCD and Anxiety for Sheppard Pratt, and he is an author. I'm sure a lot of you know him. He's been on the show before. He's written some incredible books about OCD. He is just about to release a new book about teens and OCD, and he's just released as well the most recent second edition of the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD. And I was so thrilled to have him on. We just chatted and talked about the main concepts of these two really important books. Now, even though we're talking about teens and the skills that you would use for teens with OCD, I actually found that these are the skills that adults really enjoy using as well. And he brings some really cool concepts into the conversation. So I'm going to take you directly there to listen to Jon's wisdom. In the meantime, if you have a few minutes, please do go onto wherever you're listening, Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, wherever you're listening, and leave a review. My goal for 2021 is to help over what I was helping last year. I keep being encouraged to pick a number of people I want to help, but I really can't wrap my head around that. But I would really love if you could leave a review. The more reviews you leave, the more visibility the podcast gets, and the more visibility the podcast gets, the more people I can help. And this is a free service, so I wanted to really push the reviews this year if possible. So if you have a few minutes, just go on, leave your honest review. I would so appreciate it. That being said, let's go over to the show. All right. Favorite people in the house right here. I'm so excited to have, again, Jon Hershfield. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me back.
I'm so happy to have you back. You have done some huge things.
It's been an interesting year for all of us. Yeah,
I've been busy. Many reasons, for many reasons. You have some new books coming out.
I do. This is true. I love your podcast style, by the way. It's exactly how I talk to kids. I just point out what's going on with them. You're wearing a blue shirt. Aren't you wearing a blue shirt? It's so cute.
Good for you and your blue shirt.
I do. 2 weeks ago, the second edition of the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD came out, and I'm excited about that. People seem to be enjoying that so far. And then in March, the OCD Workbook for teens comes out. I'm very, very excited about that as well.
Yeah. Tell me about the teens, because this is such a huge need, right? So, of course, you've completely filled the mindfulness piece in giving people those amazing skills. And now you've updated it, and I want to hear all about that. But, for so long, I haven't felt like I've loved any of the teen books. So tell us a little bit about how that came about. What inspired you to start to write that book?
I'm not really sure. I had been thinking about it for a long time. I had sent myself an email at some point. This is how I communicate with my future self. I have an idea. I'll send myself an email. And I'd sent myself an email that was something like, Teen Mindfulness Workbook or something like that. And then I just kind of forgot about it. But I guess it got out there in the universe because at some point, New Harbinger, for whom I've written all of my books, asked if I had any interest in writing a teen OCD workbook. And I said yes. And that's pretty much the end of that story.
Right. You're like, I have an email to match that exact question.
Yeah, I'm not sure who came up with it first. But I guess what got me really kind of excited about the idea was that it kind of reminded me of when a family member has OCD, where I was thinking about, who am I writing this book for, right? What do people want to see? And in the family member book, it's, I want OCD sufferers to be able to look at it and say, yeah, all right, my mom could read this. Because it's very hard to share that part of your life with people sometimes. And if you're going to share material, you want to make sure that it's representing you clearly. Right. So then I thought, well, what, this isn't a book for parents of teens. This is a book for teens. What do they need to know? What do they really need to know? Because of course they don't want to read a workbook. Why would they want to read why would they want to read anything? No offense to the avid teen readers, that they're awesome, but it can be kind of taxing, and especially if it's something about mental health, which maybe they don't want to be focusing on it. Even if they're suffering, maybe they don't want to focus on it more than they already have to.
Right.
So I thought about what they would be willing to read, and then I thought about what I wish I had known when I was a teenager. And so it takes all of the concepts that I think many of us are familiar with from the Mindfulness Workbook and other books, but it just puts it into a language that I hope is accessible to teens. And it kind of I just sort of broke it down. It always starts with the table of contents. And I just thought, well, okay, first things first, they need to know about this. And then they need to know about that. And then, of course, there's ERP. And then there's mindfulness. And it just kind of wrote itself. Before I knew it, there it was.
Oh, my gosh. Anybody who says that a book wrote itself, I literally want to get down and I am not worthy. I just can't. The idea of a book writing itself to me right at this point in my life just blows me away.
I think the hardest part was not just regurgitating what I'd already written. I mean, it's the same. It's the same stuff in the sense that we all have an understanding of the core concepts necessary for developing some mastery over OCD, but I didn't want to just use the same metaphors over and over again or say the same things. That was the hardest part, which is oh man, I used this metaphor in overcoming harm OCD, and it's the perfect metaphor for this, but I can't reuse it. I have to come up with another one.
Right.
So yeah, that was the hardest part. But I found it. Two things I found helpful was just stopping periodically and trying to remember what it was like to be a teenager and what would have made me laugh or what would have made me roll my eyes. And I tried to have a mix of both of those tones. But I wanted there to be a lot of validation as well. I didn't want to go on and on about how painful it is to have OCD, but I also didn't want to just gloss over that either.
Right.
I wanted it to seem legitimate. And the other thing that was really helpful too is I added this visual component, and it really just started with a conversation with Sean Shinnock, who's a great OCD advocate and an amazing artist. And we had a conversation at some point about horror movies or monsters or something like that. And I just thought, well, wouldn't it be cool to have visuals in here that represent each chapter and that kind of present it as this kind of relationship between a person and their monster. And from there, we collaborated on, what each chapter would look like. And there's these just amazing illustrations in there. I can't wait for everybody to see them.
I can only imagine. I'm such a huge Sean fan. So he's been on the podcast and I just adore him. And he's so in tune with that age group too, which I think you two together are going to kill it. I'm so excited to see what you've done. And already, because I've seen the table of contents, I think you've probably achieved everything you wanted. So I want to ask you some questions. So one of the chapters, I believe it's one of the first ones, says, who is super jazzed about having a mental illness? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Who's super jazzed about having a mental health issue? That's chapter 1. That's the first thing I wanted people to see, which is hey, guess what? This is a self-help book. It's a mental health book. This is something you probably think of, older people doing, and out of desperation. And here you are holding it in your hands and hooray, you've been diagnosed. Most kids are not thrilled by this idea because they don't fully understand it, what it means. And they already have a lot of scary stories in their head. And now there's this other scary story of, I'm going to be living with this, forever. And, what if I don't get better and all these things. So I wanted to just get out in front of that and say, yeah, obviously this is not, you didn't just discover some cool thing about yourself that you're not super happy about addressing. So in that chapter, it's not even really about OCD. It's about what it means to have a diagnosis, what the word disorder means. And I'm just trying to encourage the reader to consider how many people they know in their life, in their network, who have a challenge, have a diagnosis of some kind. And what do they think about those people? Because I'm already sort of planting the seeds there about self-compassion, right? Yeah. If you don't think that person's a loser for having a diagnosis, then there's no reason to start on yourself with that, right?
Right. And then think about it. That's the age where people are starting to identity form, right? And you're breaking down how to not make it like this is who you are, this is your identity now. I love that you brought that up right at the front. Because, I mean, think about me as a teen, you're basically spending half your day like, who am I? Who am I? What do I do? Like, where do I belong?
So I don't know. I might not have even mentioned OCD in the first chapter, or if I do, it's in passing, because I just really wanted to start with like, okay, look, so you've got this thing that has a name, it's a diagnosis, and here's what that really means to have a thing,
right.
and it's not maybe what you thought it was. And then in the next chapter, I go into OCD and what that's all about.
Right. I love it. Okay, tell me about boss level boredom.
Yeah, so boss level is a reference to when you're playing a video game and you get to the hardest part of the game. It's the most frustrating part of the game. It's usually where there's some big monster that's extraordinarily difficult to beat, and you can't get on to the next level of the game until you beat this monster. You can't even enjoy the game. I get frustrated sometimes if I play a game and I get to a boss level and I just can't beat it, and then it's like, well, this isn't fun anymore. Like, right. I want a discount. I want my money back. It was fun to have the challenge, but then when I can't get to that next level, I feel like I'm being like something's being taken from me. Take it personally, So when I'm explaining mindfulness in this chapter, I'm really talking about stripping away all of the things that we use to keep our mind occupied. So taking away, the phone, the TV, the music, the videos, and everything that distracts us, and just seeing what's left. And a lot of kids and adults, they think about mindfulness, they think about meditation, they think boring, they think watching the breath, sitting, feeling the weight of my body in the chair, like, oh, it's the worst.
Right.
But if you understand what you're doing and you can actually observe boredom as an object of attention, you can observe that desire to get away from the breath and go back to your video game or your phone or whatever, then actually that's kind of interesting. And that's the sort of top shelf, that level. If you can get to that level of actually understanding, who and what you are when you stripped away all the distractions, that's what it is to be mindful. So that's why I call it boss level boredom.
It's great. I love it. I mean, I've never heard the term boss level before. Like, I have no understanding of computer games because it's not what I've ever had exposure to, but it makes such sense because I can visualize exactly what you're talking about.
What's great? The editors of this book often came to me with like, what does that mean? Because I was using a lot of pop references and things like that. But because I'm in my 40s, I don't even think the pop references are correct. I think they're off by like a decade or two. So neither the editors nor the readers will know what I'm talking about, but that's okay because I know what I'm talking about.
No, I don't think that's true.
I can explain it.
I've seen people get frustrated at the boss level. So that, but I actually I didn't know that was the terminology, but it is exactly that when you're kind of trying to be mindful. And how often do you hear of even adults and teens and children trying to be mindful and they do it for a few minutes and then they like throw the stapler at the wall, right? Mm-hmm. And that's how I imagine it to be. And I love that you're encouraging, what would you say it's a curiosity? And what would you say the trick is to this?
Yeah, I'd say it's a curiosity. It's looking at meditation and mindfulness as actually kind of an adventure, kind of a challenge. You just, if you understand what game you're playing, then it can't be boring because you can only get deeper and deeper into it. But if you don't understand what you're doing or why you're doing it, then obviously it's like, well, I miss my TV show. I'd rather be doing that.
Exactly. It's like a science experiment.
Yeah, which can be exciting.
Yeah. Seriously, I love it. Okay, tell me about your way of saying cool story, bra, because I think this is so incredible. It's funny because I've even had clients say similar things, but I want to hear your perspective.
So the chapter is called Cool Story Bro, Responding to Unwanted Thoughts. And it's basically, at that point in the book, it's about halfway through the book, I've explained what intrusive thoughts are about, what compulsions are about, what mental rituals are, and how to meditate, all the rest of it. And now it's like, okay, but what am I supposed to actually do, right? When these thoughts come up, what am I supposed to actually do?
Right.
And I don't know if I did it exactly this way or some variation on it, but my assessment of the situation is you can do whatever you want with your thoughts except play defense with OCD. Once you go on the defensive, then you're admitting that you guys are sort of equal partners and you're being attacked and the thought is a threat, and that's what the OCD lives off of. So that leaves you with ignoring it, which can take you so far, being mindful of it, just sort of acknowledging it but not responding. Agreeing with the potential, like, maybe, maybe not. Or agreeing and amplifying, saying, trying to outdo the OCD with something audacious and absurd. And so all of that kind of falls into the category of of relating to the OCD. Like, it believes it has something important to tell you and you don't agree. And so it's telling you you're a really terrible person, or you're going to get sick, or you're going to wake up tomorrow and be a different identity than the one you thought you were, and your whole life's going to fall apart. And you're like, yeah, that's cool story, bro. Kind of in the middle of something, but I'll get back to you later.
That's why I love it.
And everybody has that one friend,
Right. And that's the thing. And that's exactly what you would say is like, cool story, brah, which is like, you've recognized it. You could correct me if I'm saying this wrong. You've recognized it, but you're kind of like not getting engaged.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's not, I like it because it's not overtly antagonistic. It's sort of subtly antagonistic. It's kind of like you're scrolling through your news feed and you're like, yeah, I'm just going to scroll past this one.
Yeah. I love this. Now, this is, of course, a book for teens. Would you use the same tools for adults and children?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's some variation when you're working with kids, some approaches that are different than when you're working with adults. I think the younger the person, just from a developmental level, I think there's going to be more externalizing. My OCD is telling me this, or the OCD is making me do that. And I think, for adults, that can also be helpful, but it can also become its own kind of crutch and self-reassurance. And it can be better to just, let go of the externalized component and just be like, oh, I'm having these thoughts, but I don't have to identify with them, which is hard to explain to an 8-year-old, obviously.
Exactly.
Teens, I think it's mostly about language. It's mostly about buy-in. I don't think that there's a fundamental difference in the actual treatment approach. It's more, how do you get the message into their brains? Right.
See, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here just because you've piqued my interest. So can you share with me, because probably, and I ask this often to interviewees, is one of the most common questions I get asked is, what do I do with intrusive thoughts? Right. And so this is a really wonderful approach. I love it. In fact, I know a lot of adults who use a similar approach, right? Like Good One OCD or Good Try or whatever that might be. Can you sort of share, and because a lot of the listeners are adults as well, is, if you weren't to use that formula, what other formulas would you encourage people to use, or tools?
Well, so the cool story, bro, is the idea is with the idea of all of them, with a non-defensive approach, is that you're trying to let go of the barriers to the thought. So if you think about thoughts going in one ear and out the other, the problem with OCD is they go in one ear and we go, whoa, not that thought, no thank you. And somewhere in between the left ear and the right ear, we kind of put up a mental hand and block the thought, saying, you shall not pass. And we try to push it out the same ear that it came in. And the thought itself has no politics. It can't be argued with. It's going out the right ear. The question is, are you going to let it through now? Or are you going to suffer a lot and let it through later? Because at some point you're going to let it through because it doesn't go in the other direction. So responding to intrusive thoughts by kind of dropping that barrier, that's the path to real mastery over this. And you could do it in a lot of different ways, but first you have to notice when you are putting up a barrier, and that barrier is compulsions. It's mental rituals, it's rumination, it's trying to figure it out, it's trying to replace it or work on it somehow to make it easier to pass through, instead of it just being, the leaf on the stream that it really is, and letting it pass through, even if you think it's an ugly leaf.
Right.
So you can say like, yeah, okay, fine, I'll let this thought pass, which is kind of the cool story bro approach. Or like I said before, you could literally just not pay attention to it, or you could pay a very gentle attention to it. Or you can even move it along like, okay, yes, that's true. This is the worst thought that everybody's ever had. It's so terrible. Okay, all right, bye-bye now, right? And then kind of really relating to the thought like it's something that you noticed that distracted you from the present moment. And now that you've realized that, you've acknowledged it or not acknowledged it or agreed with it or didn't agree with it or whatever, just let it go. And then return to what you're doing before you got distracted. Right. Where was I before I thought that something interesting was happening? I got confused. I had a thought and I thought that was interesting. Turns out now it's just a thought. Now I can go back to what I was doing.
Right. You know your stuff. I like it. I do.
To be fair, because I'm thinking about the people who are listening to this and going like, yeah, that sounds easy, but it's obviously harder when the thought comes tagged with an emotional response. That's like an automatic reaction. And even harder than that when it comes tagged with a sensory response, something happens in your body.
Yeah.
That if you're listening to this and you're struggling with that, the same rules apply. It's just, of course, it's just a little bit harder because you're wired to take your body more seriously than your thoughts.
Right.
There's probably good reason for that. But nonetheless, you can still have the same kind of response like, oh, there's that sensation again. Okay, well, guess I'll never know what that is. Or, oh, maybe it's that thing. Or maybe just letting it go and not trying to figure it out.
Right.
But you can't try to argue it down because that's where we start to get confused.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like the metaphor of going in one ear and then I like the way that you explain that. And I think it is also helpful in terms of you talking about curiosity, because you could be curious about the sensation too, right? Like, I'm noticing the thought that I'm having a heart attack, but I'm also noticing the tight chest. Or would you say that that's the same approach?
Yeah, absolutely. It's you stepping out of the story and watching the story unfold. Or maybe more to the point, not watching the story unfold, just being aware that a story is unfolding and then returning to what you're doing before you got distracted by the story.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for giving your perspective on that, because again, I feel like that's such a complex, and you covered all the bases. It's such a complex question. Like, what do I do when I have an intrusive thought? I mean, I don't know if that's your most common thought, but it's a common question. It's 100% the most common question I get. And I love hearing, different people's way of looking at it. And I think you've hit it on the head. Now, what would you say? I mean, in terms of the cool story bra, let's say you accidentally or habitually or whatever have already gotten into a wrestle, with your obsession. You're doing some kind of mental compulsion or so forth. Would you go back to doing cool story bra, or what would be your response to that?
Your job is to try to control the things that you can control. So if you are automatically slipping into rumination, or you're automatically slipping into rationalization or arguing with the thoughts, you're not making that, you might not be making that decision consciously, right? It can become an ingrained habit. You get these cues. When I feel this or when I think that, I must ruminate, and it just sort of gets used to doing it. In the same way that when we meditate, our brain might get restless because we're not distracted and it starts to look for things to do. We're not inviting the brain to do it. It's just kind of doing what it does. And you don't need to beat yourself up about that. You don't need to be, I'm ruminating. What's wrong with me? You just need to notice that in the moment that you become aware, that you become conscious, that you are involved in this process, that's when you need to go back to what I'm calling cool story bra here.
Yeah.
Just like, okay. And just kind of dropping, you realize you're holding something that you don't need to hold, and then you let go of it. Right. But it's only in that moment that you realize it. You don't have to give yourself a hard time for not having noticed. You'll notice a little bit earlier and earlier each time.
Right. With that awareness. I've used this example a bunch of times is since I went home to Australia to visit. And it was shocking to me when I came out of a 14-day quarantine, my instinct was to duck from people. Now, somehow I've never learned that. That was never something that was so habitual, right? Like my instinct was as soon as I was coming out of the hotel, as soon as the porter guy came to get my bags, I was like, where's my mask? And I've got to run away from this human being.
Right.
Until I was like, oh, how interesting that my normal response now with COVID is to duck. And I didn't judge myself for that. But that's basically the human condition. People would naturally do compulsions. They're naturally going to want to remove themselves from harm. Yeah. Right. But I just thought it was funny how habitual things can easily become, even things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the barriers that people face when trying to relate to their unwanted thoughts in this more casual attitude, and not reassure themselves or not try to get certain about the thoughts, is they become very attached to this false notion of authenticity. I feel afraid, or I feel like maybe I'm a bad person. And for me to just act like I'm not afraid or act like I'm not a bad person, it's kind of fake. It doesn't feel like that's what I'm supposed to do. And I think a way to cut through that barrier is to remember that only really applies to people who don't know they have OCD. who are just following their feelings around, trying to do the best they can to be authentic to what their body's telling them. But if you know you have OCD, it's not authentic to do compulsions because you already understand that. I'm assuming a person who's had some education on OCD and maybe had some treatment, you're doing compulsions because you're used to it, because it's hard to resist, but not because that's your authentic self. Your authentic self doesn't want to do compulsions. Your authentic self doesn't mind that feeling of denial or fakery that the OCD throws at you when you try to dismiss an urge to do a compulsion. That is your authentic self. It's just that your body's not cooperating because it's been conditioned to do what you described. It's been conditioned into that fear. My guess is when the pandemic's over and everything opens up, and that we're going to have different levels of people who, at different rates, who start to be more and more comfortable.
Right.
At some point, I'm going to see an old friend at the mall, and they're going to come up to me for a hug, and I'm going to dive behind a dumpster. Because I might not be ready, but I'll get there.
Right. I agree. And I'm so grateful that you sort of brought that into it, because I think that that's 100% a piece of the pie. This sort of idea around authenticity, which is so great that you're bringing that up. Talk to me, because I know this is actually in the Mindfulness Workbook, which we're going to cover here in a little bit, but around this idea of a thought isn't a fact and a feeling isn't a fact. I think I've killed your phrase there. Can you kind of share that for those who haven't yet read those books?
Yeah, in the Mindfulness Workbook, there's three very simple things that get described. One is thoughts are thoughts, not threats. The other is feelings are feelings, not facts. And the third is, I believe it's sensations are sensations, not mandates to act, or something like that. So, mindfulness is very much about calling things, what they are. And I'm very intrigued by this idea of being able to draw the distinction between an experience and a story. I think that's where we get the most confused, is we're kind of walking around telling ourselves stories all the time about our experience instead of just having the experience. So when a thought presents itself and says, this is going to harm you, or you did a bad thing, or something like that, the thought is just the string of words. You can sort of picture it being written on a wall somewhere, being flashed up on a screen like credits in a movie. That's what the thought is. It's just a piece of language that's in your brain. The story is the meaning that you attribute to that language. And we get very confused between, but is it a true story or a fake story? That's what we want to know. Is it fiction or nonfiction? And I don't know if I put it in this book or one of the other books, but
it's on paper somewhere. I know it.
Somewhere it's written down. This idea that, if you go into a library, there's a fiction section, which is stories that are not true. And there's a nonfiction section that's stories that are true. But the important thing to remember is that the nonfiction section is still made up of books. It's still made up of stories that are factual, but they're not the same thing as the event. So if I have a book that says the Civil War on it, I could say this is the most accurate depiction of all the events of the Civil War. But the thing I'm holding in my hand is not the Civil War. It's a book. It's paper, it's words, it's writing, it's interpretation, it's organized in a way to entice me and to educate me. So it's the same with thoughts. We don't want to get caught up in the debate of, is this story fiction or nonfiction? We're just talking about the fact that there's a thought and then there's a story about the thought. And we can experience the thought without having to buy into the story behind the thought.
Right.
And therefore, by definition, no thought can actually be a threat. Only the story about the thought can then become threatening. The thought itself, you write on a piece of paper, it doesn't look like anything. It's just letters, right? Same thing, but a little bit more difficult to buy in. Feelings are feelings, not facts, right? A lot of times we feel guilty for no reason. That's life with OCD. It doesn't mean you did something wrong. Or we wake up anxious. It doesn't mean we're going to have a bad day. It's just the body's doing whatever it's doing, and you're not inventing or creating these things. You're not sitting around going, it'd be good. Let's experience sadness now. Let's bring up the sadness. No, you just might become aware at any moment that you're not distracted, that you were sad about something, and that emotion came up to be had, and you were having it. And that's your entire involvement in it. Now the question is, what do I do with it? How do I respond to it? And not assume that because you're having this feeling, something bad has necessarily happened or there's something you have to do. Right. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, the most challenging one, I think, is with sensations, because we're really designed to listen to the body for cues for, are we hungry? Are we, are we attracted to someone? This is one that gets people very upset sometimes. But the body is very complicated and doesn't do what we want it to all the time. And so the mere presence of a sensation is not proof of the story that you might have about that sensation. Yeah. You might experience pain. It could be just a random nerve firing, or it could be that there's something seriously wrong in your body and you need to go to the doctor. There are ways to get to the bottom of that, but it shouldn't be your first step. Your first step should just acknowledge pain, pressure, tingling, warmth, blood flow, whatever it is.
Right. Thank you. I'm happy that you sort of reviewed that. I think a lot of people, I'm sorry, I just keep asking you questions. I'm just going.
What kind of interview is this?
No, I'm totally off track with where I originally wanted to be. Is what I would imagine a lot of people immediately say is that seems very irresponsible.
Yes.
To just not buy into the story.
Yes, it does seem very irresponsible.
What are your thoughts?
That was
cool
my
story.
entire.
Cool story, bro.
Cool story. Yeah. I mean, that's really what I'm talking about. I mean, that's that word seem, though, right? Yeah. So what you're telling me is that the thought is arising.
Yeah.
That you're being irresponsible. And the feeling is arising of unease. And then maybe there's sensations arising of tightness in your chest and a lump in your throat or something like that. And all of that is telling a story about irresponsible you who wasn't vigilant enough. And as a result of your lack of vigilance, the worst thing you could think of came true. And if only you had proven with 100% certainty that this bad thing wasn't going to happen, everything would be okay, which is, of course, not possible. Right. So it's a setup. Of course, the OCD is going to try to, here I am externalizing it again, but it's going to try to rope you back in. You're sort of conditioned to have this desire for completion, this urge to compulse followed by this relief from compulsing. And the moment you say, no, I'm going to go a different direction, your brain's hey, what happened? What are you doing? You sure? Don't you want to compulse? It's going to try to pull you back in. It's trying to help.
Story number
you're
2.
Trying to train it. Yeah, story number 2.
Yeah, I love it. Very good. Okay. I've got one more question about the team book, and then I want to head over to mindfulness really quick. So let's get physical. Ew, sorry, not sorry.
Yeah, that's the actual title. That's the one that comes right before, I'm looking at now, using brutal, savage, ruthless self-compassion and being awesome at not knowing. Let's get physical is about interoceptive exposure. So this is about doing exposure to bodily sensations that trigger your unwanted thoughts or the sensations you're afraid of. So it's a workbook. So it's, there's exercises, there's things to write down, there's experiments to run. And so this has some sort of like some ideas for how to create the physical sensations that you might associate with your obsessions, and kind of encouraging the reader to come up with their own creative ways of sticking it to the OCD.
Yeah.
Like, look, I can respond casually to the thought or the feeling. Check this out. Watch me bring on the full experience. What do you think about that, OCD? Right, that's
bring it on. Bring it on.
Yeah.
And what would be like a couple of examples for those of people who don't know what an interoceptive is? Like, can you give me a few random examples?
I can't recall off the top of my head which ones I put into the book, but the most common ones that come to mind are, if you're afraid of shortness of breath or panic, you might breathe through a straw for a little bit, which kind of triggers that sensation that even though you are getting enough oxygen, your brain thinks maybe you're not. Or if you're afraid of being dizzy, you might spin around in a desk chair for a little bit. If you're afraid of looking flushed or sweaty, or if your heart rate being too high, you might jog in place for a little bit.
Right.
So ideas like that.
Yeah, good. Thank you. All right. So let's move over because, given how, hardworking you are, you're amazing. You bring out 2 new books at the same time. Again, blows my mind. I'm going to move over to the updated version. So this is the 2nd edition of the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD. Congratulations. It's huge.
Thank you. It's my first 2nd edition. Yeah. It's very, very cool. Yeah. 7 years since the first one.
It's amazing. And I think it really just shows how great that workbook was, a tremendous success. So that's so wonderful. You've added in some pieces that I was so thrilled to see. And so I would love to just get a little bit of your update, right? So when I read it, I printed out the pieces that, were new which I loved. I got my highlighter out, did the whole thing.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about the reason and how you introduced habituation and inhibitory learning to this workbook.
So the original workbook focuses exclusively on habituation, and habituation in short form is just feeling less in the presence of the same trigger, feeling less fear, feeling less disgust, feeling less of whatever it is that you don't want to feel by repeatedly exposing to the thing that scares you until your brain says, all right, I keep trying to tell you this is a problem and you keep treating my alarms like they're false, so I'm going to stop putting energy into these alarms and do something better with the energy I have. That's pretty much the brain's perspective on habituation. And it's an important part of understanding how exposure and response prevention works and how to develop mastery over your OCD. And in many ways, I think it's probably the first thing you want to learn and the first thing you want to do. I mean, especially if your OCD is in the sort of moderate to severe range, you want some relief from your symptoms. You want some as soon as possible, right? You want to be suffering less.
Yeah.
And over the last several years, there's been a lot more studies coming out and a lot more therapists discussing this issue of inhibitory learning, which was all sort of pioneered by Michelle Krask and colleagues. And also Jonathan Abramowitz has done a lot of, I think, really interesting writing and studies on this subject. And, the central thesis here is that we learn to flee from certain experiences. And when we re-engage with those experiences and form new and less threatening or just alternate experiences around those triggers, we kind of bury that learning and we start having other options besides fleeing that come to mind first. Mm-hmm. And I like to use the metaphor of going to see a horror movie, for example. There's some things in life that you don't want to be boring, right? And so if you're someone who likes horror movies, you're going to buy a ticket, you're going to go in there, and you're not going to be saying, oh, gee, I hope this bores me to death, right? No, I hope this activates me and scares me and gives me something to talk about. And, if you're like me, maybe it'll give me crazy nightmares and that'll be kind of fun to talk about, And if you're watching the movie, something happens in the movie that shocks you. And if I freeze frame you in that moment, you are not having a good time. Everything about your body is saying, you're in danger, get out of here. And then when I unfreeze you, you go back to your popcorn, you turn to your friend, you say, oh, that was crazy. And, and then you wait for the next exciting thing to happen. And at no point do you feel like you need to run out of the theater. Because, you've been to enough movies and you've had enough experiences feeling that way in different contexts with different flavored popcorn around different people and, different movies approach, kind of presenting themselves in different ways, that you now have all these other ways of relating to that fear, including just go with it, including just embrace it, right? Whereas if you'd never had that experience before and you just woke up with that experience in your body, immediately you would run from whatever it is you think was causing it. So you learn to be inhibited from going to that space of this is intolerable, I need to get out of here.
Right.
And what that looks like on the user end is you learn to stop doing compulsions, not because you've stopped having any response to the things you don't like, but because you've stopped having the compulsion being the only response you can have to that experience.
Right. So you use the acronym or mnemonic, always do something courageous and vulnerable, to help bring in all of the components of inhibitory learning. Would you be able to share those with us?
Yes, absolutely. And I should give a shout out to Jon Abramowitz because the mnemonic is really based on something he wrote in one of the IOCDF newsletters about inhibitory learning. And he breaks down sort of 5 things to consider when doing ERP and you're aiming for inhibitory learning and you're thinking, how can I get inhibitory learning? How can I get this person to generalize their mastery of this obsession? And so the first one is the letter A, so always, and that stands for anxiety tolerance, right? So the focus is not on, okay, how long do I have to do this until my anxiety goes away? This is really terrible. I hate doing this. The focus is on, okay, I'm experiencing anxiety. This is a good thing. I want to experience this anxiety. I want to make room for this anxiety. I don't want this anxiety to be the reason why I can't do this. Mm-hmm. I need to get better at having these feelings. That's why I'm doing this exposure.
Mm-hmm.
D stands for, it stands for disconfirming expectations. So if you want to have a new association come up, you want to have a new memory. So instead of this triggers me to run away, now this triggers me to do something other than run away. You have to kind of wake up the brain to realize that something is different from the way you thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So if your expectation is that something is going to be intolerable, and then you go and tolerate it, that's disconfirming an expectation.
Mm.
That's why we don't tell people, probably you won't get sick if you touch this doorknob, so just touch it. Because now we're expecting everything's going to be okay, and then we do the exposure. And just, side note here, let's presume everything I'm saying is happening before COVID, because I want to get into more discussions about that. So if you go into the exposure really feeling like, okay, I know to some extent I'm not going to do something, my therapist's not going to do something that's going to kill me, but I really don't know how this is going to turn out. Maybe I'll have a panic attack. Maybe I will, get sick. Maybe my fear will come true. Maybe this will prove that I'm gay or a serial killer or whatever it is that, in this moment my brain is telling me I can't be. And instead of reassuring ourselves with too much cognitive therapy at the front end, we go into it with an open mind of I'm willing to take in whatever the world is going to offer me here. And then when we survive, even if we don't have a particularly good time, right? Just like, again, in that horror movie, you might be somewhat traumatized by the experience, but as long as it doesn't kill you, the brain goes, oh, this was different from what we expected. We should remember that more than the thing we assume could happen. Mm-hmm. So that we're not completely bound to this idea of I have to respond to this the same way every time.
Right.
So always do something. So the S is surprise. And really this is kind of another way of saying disconfirming expectations. But the point is we want the brain to remember. We want the brain to be kind of shocked at our ability to confront our fears, right? Anybody can kind of clench their jaw and their fists and hold their breath and tolerate something, but it takes a serious badass to open up to an exposure and say, let's have all the feels. Let's see what happens. And to surprise yourself with your ability. So look for exposures where there's the opportunity to be surprised,
right,
including things not going your way. I mean, it's really fascinating, but if something is harder than you thought it would be, but you still survive it, that's just as surprising as if it's easier.
Right.
As long as it doesn't happen every single time. If you get through something you didn't think you were going to get through, and surprise, you'll remember that. And it's that memory that's important. A lot of the talk about inhibitory learning, it's about being able to recall that in the moment. Oh, I remember being able to handle this.
Right.
Not I don't know what to do.
Right.
And then the C, combining fear cues. So I think my first version of this, it was always do something crazy vulnerable, but I changed it to courageous and vulnerable. So there wasn't any confusion. And so combining fear cues, it's kind of what I was talking about before with interoceptive exposure. It's bringing as much of the experience as you can at one time. So you might have one fear cue that is the visual of the thing you're afraid of, and another fear cue that's a sensory experience you have around that. And you want to try to bring those into the exposure at the same time. So you're getting the most complete picture of what you're exposing to possible. Because again, that will really make your brain pay attention to what happens next.
Right.
And then the last one, well, first I just really wanted to use the word vulnerable because I think of that as a strength, as a power thing and not a weakness. But in this discussion, the V stands for variety. And this is really about generalizing. I can have somebody touch the doorknob in my office over and over and over again, and they'll stop being afraid of that doorknob. But what about other things with handles? What about the world of things we grab, right? Mm-hmm. I wanted to generalize so that you're not doing the whack-a-mole thing that we all complain about with OCD of and then I got to habituate to this, and then I got to habituate to that, over and over and over again.
Right.
No, we want this learning to actually apply across the board.
Right.
So variety might mean you're doing a combination of in vivo, imaginal exposures, and interoceptive exposures, doing them in different settings while you're in different moods at different times of the day, around different people, with different music playing. Mix it up as much as possible so that you're giving your brain enough to remember about this experience besides, I hate it, I'm out, which is really what we're used to experiencing.
Right. And all those factors give a sense of mastery, right? Like I can tolerate this. I could handle this if it happened to pop up. I have the learning that I've done it in the past, or I've done something similar. Would you say that's sort of the learning?
That's a big part of the learning. And I think another part of it is when we focus exclusively on habituation, which again, I want to get out in front of this. I'm not saying habituation is bad. I think habituation is important and we want it to happen. But when we make it the only focus of the work, we're basically admitting that anxiety is bad and disgust is bad. And we shouldn't feel anxiety and disgust because it's bad. And if we could just get rid of it, life would be better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not fair. And that sets us up for being unkind to ourselves when we can't make our anxiety and disgust go away completely, or when it goes away, but then it comes back, a few months later and we think we did something wrong. A lot of times when people talk about OCD, they talk about irrational thoughts. But the way I think about it is we have irrational ways of dealing with thoughts, which is not the same thing as the thoughts themselves being irrational.
Right.
I mean, you have this experience as well treating OCD. People come and tell you what they're afraid of. And it's very rare that what they're afraid of isn't scary.
Right.
Nobody wants to get sick. Nobody wants to lose a loved one. Nobody wants to lose their identity in some way or find out that they've harmed someone. Nobody wants that. It's not strange to have that thought and just, because of your conditioning, because of all the learning that's taken place up to this point, think, gee, that's unpleasant, right? And that's disturbing and that's scary. Now, there's varying degrees of rational to irrational ways of responding to those thoughts. And if your behavioral response to that thought is to try to get 100% certain that it won't come true, that's not rational because that doesn't exist in the real world.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if we're talking about getting all of our anxiety or disgust to go away completely, it's a setup. It's okay to find your thoughts a little disturbing. They're just not supposed to take your whole day or your whole life away from you.
Right.
And I often tell people, I can't joke about it, but it's true. If you followed me around throughout the day, I'm sure you would catch moments where you just saw me stop for a second and go, ugh, and then just and then went back to what I was doing. And that's me responding totally appropriately to some terrible thing I just thought.
Right. I love that you shared that. That's really cool. And thank you for explaining those steps, because it seems very basic, but it's quite complex to get all of those steps in, and you've explained it really well.
Thank you. Yeah. I hope that's the takeaway from the readers as well, because I know I was taking something that I wouldn't claim to be an expert in. I just sort of barely get it, and then I'm trying to distill it into kind of a workbook form.
Right.
So I hope that's what the readers get.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So I'm so grateful to have you on. Where can people get info on the books?
All my books are available on Amazon and other bookstores, I think Barnes & Noble. And you can get to me through my website at ocdbaltimore.com, which is now also the website for the Center for OCD and Anxiety at Sheppard Pratt, which is where I'm working now. And you can follow me on Instagram at OCD Baltimore. And I think I'm on Facebook and Twitter. And so if you just think OCD Baltimore, you'll reliably find me.
Good. Yeah, and we'll add all of those links to the show notes. Thank you so much, and congratulations on all of these successful things that you've done. It's really quite inspiring.
Thank you, and thank you for your wonderful podcast. It's inspiring to so many people, and I just love the opportunity to have been a part of it.
Thank you.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.